The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, echoing louder than the midday traffic roaring past City Hall. Officer Derek Hayes thought he was just teaching another thug a lesson in respect. He didn't care about the tailored sweatpants, the calm demeanor, or the lack of a weapon. He just saw a black man standing where he didn't belong. What Hayes didn't know was that the wrists he had just bound belonged to the Honorable Lucas Pendleton, Chief Supervising Judge of the highest court in the district, and the mayor was about to watch every single second of it. The heat radiating off the concrete steps of the Monroe County City Hall was enough to blur the horizon. It was a miserable Tuesday in late August, the kind of sweltering afternoon that shortened tempers and made the air feel thick enough to chew. Lucas Pendleton wasn't scheduled to be on the bench until Thursday. For the first time in 3 weeks, he had taken a morning entirely for himself. Lucas was a man who commanded respect without ever having to ask for it. At 58, he possessed a tall, broad-shouldered frame that spoke of a lifetime of discipline. Today, however, stripped of his heavy, imposing black robes, he was just a man enjoying a rare moment of peace. He wore a simple, unbranded grey-hooded sweatshirt, pushed up at the forearms, dark athletic trousers, and a pair of worn-in running shoes. He held a half-empty cup of artisanal black coffee in his right hand. He had stopped at the plaza outside the southern entrance of City Hall, leaning casually against the low granite wall to check a text message from his daughter, Chloe, who had just started her freshman year at Georgetown. He was smiling at the photo she had sent of her cramped dorm room when the shadow fell over him. "You lost, buddy?" The voice was grating, laced with an immediate, unearned hostility. Lucas slowly lowered his phone and turned his head. Standing a few feet away was a patrol officer. The name tag on his uniform read, Hayes. Officer Derek Hayes was in his late 20s, built like a fire hydrant, with a high and tight haircut, and eyes hidden behind reflective aviator sunglasses. His hands were already resting menacingly on his utility belt, thumbs hooked near his radio and his sidearm. "Excuse me?" Lucas asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. It was a voice that had silenced sprawling, chaotic courtrooms with a single syllable, but right now he kept it perfectly level. I said, "Are you lost?" Hayes took a step closer, invading Lucas's personal space. The scent of cheap spearmint gum and stale sweat wafted off the officer. "This is a restricted zone for city personnel. We don't want people loitering out here, scoping out the building." Lucas looked around. The plaza was a public thoroughfare. To his left, a young white couple was feeding pigeons. To his right, a group of interns in cheap suits were eating sandwiches on the steps. Yet, Hayes had made a beeline straight for him. Lucas knew exactly what this was. He had spent 30 years in the criminal justice system, first as a public defender, then a prosecutor, and finally a judge. He knew the choreography of this dance intimately. "I'm not loitering, Officer Hayes," Lucas said, reading the name deliberately. "I'm enjoying my coffee. And this is a public plaza." Hayes's jaw tightened. The disrespect, as he perceived it, was unacceptable. "I'm not going to ask you again. I need to see some ID, right now." "On what grounds?" Lucas asked mildly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "You need reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime to demand identification in this state. Standing on a sidewalk drinking coffee does not meet that threshold." Hayes scoffed, stepping even closer, puffing his chest out. "Oh, we got a street lawyer here. You think you know the law, pal. I am the law out here. Now give me your ID, or you're going to find out how bad your afternoon can get." Lucas's eyes narrowed slightly, though his posture remained completely relaxed. He could have ended it right then. He could have reached into his back pocket, pulled out his judicial credential, and watched the color drain from Hayes's face. He had the power to make a phone call and have this man's badge stripped before the ice melted in his coffee. But a sudden, quiet anger flared within him. Why should he have to prove he belonged here? Why should his title be the only thing that protected him from the harassment that 1,000 other young men without titles faced every single day in this city? "I will not be providing you with my identification," Lucas said firmly. "I suggest you go about your patrol, officer." "All right, tough guy." Hayes snapped his handcuffs from his belt in one fluid, practiced motion. He lunged forward, grabbing Lucas's wrist with excessive force, spilling the hot coffee over the granite stones. Lucas did not resist, though the grip was painfully tight. He let Hayes spin him around, pressing his chest against the rough stone of the wall. "Stop resisting," Hayes barked, a command performed purely for the body camera pinned to his chest. "I am completely compliant," Lucas stated clearly, his face pressed against the warm granite. "I am making no sudden movements. You are arresting me without probable cause." "Shut your mouth," Hayes snarled, snapping the heavy steel cuffs around Lucas's wrists. He clicked them tight, far too tight, the metal biting into Lucas's skin. "You're going downtown for disorderly conduct and resisting a police officer. Let's see how much of a lawyer you are from a holding cell." As Hayes roughly yanked him backward and frog-marched him toward the cruiser parked at the curb, Lucas caught the stares of the interns on the steps. They looked horrified, whispering to one another, phones slowly coming out to record. Lucas kept his head high, his expression unreadable. He didn't say another word. He was going to let Officer Hayes dig this hole as deep as he possibly could. The back of a police cruiser smells like a unique combination of industrial bleach, old sweat, and despair. Lucas had never been in the back of one before. He sat perfectly rigid on the hard plastic seat, his wrists throbbing where the metal dug into his skin with every bump in the road. In the driver's seat, Hayes was riding a high of adrenaline and misplaced authority. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel to the beat of a rock song playing faintly on the radio, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror to gloat. "Quiet now, aren't we?" Hayes sneered. "Usually, you guys have a lot more to say. Tell me about my badge. Tell me you pay my salary. Come on, give me the whole speech." Lucas maintained his absolute silence. He was mentally cataloguing everything. The unlawful detainment, the lack of Miranda warnings, though technically not required unless undergoing interrogation. Hayes's taunts were bordering on attempting to elicit an incriminating response, the excessive force used in applying the cuffs. By the time they reached the 14th Precinct, Lucas had mentally drafted a 20-page civil rights complaint. The cruiser pulled into the secure garage beneath the precinct. Hayes got out, opened the back door, and hauled Lucas out by the chain of the handcuffs. "Walk," Hayes commanded, shoving Lucas toward the heavy steel doors leading to the booking area. The booking room of the 14th Precinct was a hive of chaotic energy. Phones were ringing, officers were shouting over the din, and 3 suspected drug dealers were chained to a wooden bench, loudly arguing with each other. Behind the high desk sat Desk Sergeant Brian Miller. Miller was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man who had seen everything and possessed the weary, heavy-lidded expression of a man who just wanted to reach his pension. "Got a live one here, Sarge," Hayes announced loudly, marching Lucas up to the desk. "Refused to ID, loitering in a restricted zone, disorderly, resisted arrest." Sergeant Miller didn't immediately look up. He was typing a report with 2 fingers. Empty his pockets. "Name?" "Wouldn't give it to me," Hayes said smugly. "Thinks he knows his rights." Miller sighed, finally looking up from his monitor. He looked at the suspect. He looked at the grey hoodie, the sweatpants, the hands cuffed behind the back. Then, Miller's eyes traveled up to the man's face. Miller stopped breathing. The precinct was loud, but to Miller it suddenly felt like someone had driven a vacuum seal over the room. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse under the fluorescent lights. His hands froze above his keyboard. He blinked once, twice, hoping the exhaustion was playing tricks on his eyes. It wasn't. Standing in front of his desk, wearing handcuffs, was the man who had signed the search warrants that busted the biggest fentanyl ring in the city last month. The man who regularly had lunch with the district attorney and the chief of police. "Officer Hayes," Miller said. His voice was barely a whisper. It trembled. "Yeah, Sarge? You want me to put him in holding cell 3? It's empty." "Officer Hayes," Miller repeated, standing up so fast his chair rolled backward and slammed into the filing cabinet. The loud bang drew the attention of a few nearby officers, but Miller didn't care. "Take those cuffs off." Hayes frowned, thoroughly confused. "Sarge, he's a John Doe. He was resisting." "I said take the goddamn cuffs off him right now," Miller roared. The sudden explosive volume of the sergeant's voice acted like a shockwave. The entire booking room went dead silent. The arguing suspects shut up. The ringing phones seemed to fade into the background. Every eye turned to the desk. Hayes, startled by the sheer panic in his supervisor's voice, fumbled for his keys. He stepped behind Lucas and quickly unlocked the cuffs. Lucas brought his arms forward, wincing slightly as blood rushed back into his hands. He rubbed his deeply indented wrists slowly, methodically. He did not look at Hayes. He kept his eyes locked on Sergeant Miller. "Judge Pendleton," Miller stammered, rushing around the desk, his hands raised in a gesture of pure surrender and apology. "Your Honor, I have no words. I am so incredibly sorry. Are you injured? Do we need a medic?" The silence in the room deepened, transforming from mere quiet into a heavy, suffocating dread. Behind Lucas, Officer Hayes physically stumbled backward, as if he had been punched in the chest. His face, previously flushed with arrogant triumph, turned a sickly, mottled grey. Judge Pendleton. The name echoed in Hayes's hollow skull. "I am fine, Sergeant Miller," Lucas said. His voice carried effortlessly through the quiet room, devoid of any shouting, which somehow made it vastly more terrifying. "Though I believe my constitutional rights are somewhat bruised." "Your Honor, this is a massive misunderstanding," Miller pleaded, glaring daggers at Hayes, who looked like he was about to vomit on the linoleum floor. "Officer Hayes is relatively new to this precinct. He didn't know who you were." Lucas finally turned around to face Hayes. The young officer was visibly shaking. "That is exactly the problem, Sergeant," Lucas said, his dark eyes piercing Hayes. "He didn't know who I was, and because he didn't know I was a judge, he assumed I was a criminal. He assumed he had the right to put his hands on me, to deprive me of my liberty, simply because I existed in a space he felt I didn't belong." Lucas looked back at Miller. "I want my personal effects returned. I am leaving now. But before I go, Sergeant, I want a copy of his body camera footage preserved, and I want the Chief of Police to call my chambers by 3 o'clock. "Yes, Your Honor. Immediately, Your Honor." Miller scrambled to grab Lucas's phone and wallet from the evidence tray Hayes had just placed them in, handing them back with trembling fingers. Lucas took his belongings, adjusted his sleeves over his bruised wrists, and walked toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open, and he stepped out into the afternoon heat, leaving a room full of police officers holding their breath. Hayes stood frozen in the center of the room. He looked at Sergeant Miller. "Sarge, I swear, I thought—" "Shut your mouth, Hayes," Miller hissed venomously. "Go to the locker room. Take off your gun and your badge. You're done." Mayor Richard Caldwell was having a fantastic week. His approval ratings were up 4 points. The city council had just approved his budget for the new downtown revitalization project, and his re-election campaign was flush with fresh donor cash. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk in the mayor's office, a palatial suite on the top floor of City Hall that offered a panoramic view of the skyline. He was in the middle of practicing his speech for the annual Policemen's Benevolent Association Gala when his intercom buzzed. "Mr. Mayor," his secretary Diane said. Her voice was tight, anxious. "Chief Jenkins is here. She says it's an absolute emergency." Richard frowned, pausing his teleprompter app. Chief Sarah Jenkins was a stoic, unflappable woman. She didn't do emergencies unless something was literally on fire. "Send her in." The heavy oak doors opened, and Chief Jenkins strode in. She looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days. She was carrying a sleek silver laptop, holding it under her arm like a live explosive. "Sarah, what's going on?" Richard asked, leaning back in his leather chair, trying to project a calm he suddenly didn't feel. "You look like someone shot the Pope." "Worse, Richard," Jenkins said grimly. She didn't bother sitting down. She marched straight to his desk, opened the laptop, and spun it around to face him. She hit play. Richard watched the screen. It was body camera footage. He saw the familiar granite steps of his own building, the Southern Plaza. He saw a black man in a grey hoodie holding a coffee. Then he heard the audio. "You lost, buddy." Richard watched, his stomach slowly dropping to his shoes as the confrontation unfolded. He saw the man's calm demeanor. He heard the man clearly articulate his legal rights. And then he watched, horrified, as the officer lunged, slapped the cuffs on, and shoved the man against the wall. When the footage ended, Jenkins closed the laptop. The click of the lid shutting sounded like a gunshot in the plush office. "Okay," Richard said slowly, rubbing his temples. "An overzealous cop arrests a guy without probable cause. It's a lawsuit. It's bad optics. But why are you treating this like the end of the world?" "Richard," Jenkins said, her voice dropping an octave, "look at the man in the video again." She opened the laptop, scrubbed to a frame where the man's face was clearly visible, and paused it. Richard leaned in. He squinted. Then the blood rushed out of his head so fast he felt dizzy. He gripped the edge of his mahogany desk to steady himself. "Is that—" Richard choked on the words. "Tell me that is not Lucas Pendleton." "It's Lucas Pendleton," Jenkins confirmed bleakly. "Chief Supervising Judge of the Monroe County Superior Court, arrested outside this building for drinking coffee." "Jesus Christ!" Richard exploded, leaping out of his chair. He began pacing frantically in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Do you know what this is? This isn't a lawsuit, Sarah. This is a nuclear bomb. Pendleton is a god in the legal community. He was on the shortlist for the state Supreme Court. The ACLU is going to burn this city to the ground. The press is going to have a field day. Racist cop arrests top black judge outside mayor's window." Richard stopped pacing and whirled to face her. "Fire him! Fire the cop immediately! Right now! I want a press conference in an hour. We throw this cop to the wolves. We apologize profusely to the judge. We talk about implicit bias training." "We can't fire him, Richard," Jenkins interrupted quietly. "What do you mean we can't fire him?" Richard shouted. "He violated the Fourth Amendment on camera. He assaulted a sitting judge. I'll fire him myself." "The officer's name is Derek Hayes," Jenkins said, watching the mayor closely. "His mother's maiden name is Donnelly. He is Frank Donnelly's nephew." Richard Caldwell froze. It was as if Jenkins had just thrown a bucket of ice water over his head. Frank Donnelly, the head of the city's largest, most powerful police and firefighters union. The man whose endorsement Richard absolutely needed to win re-election in November. Donnelly was notoriously protective of his officers, viewing any disciplinary action as an attack on the entire force. He was also fiercely, irrationally loyal to his family. "You've got to be kidding me," Richard whispered, collapsing back into his chair. He suddenly felt very old and very tired. "I wish I was," Jenkins said. "Frank already called me. He caught wind of the incident at the 14th Precinct. He doesn't know it was Judge Pendleton yet. He just knows his nephew got suspended by a desk sergeant for a routine stop. Frank told me if I fire Derek, the union walks. They'll pull their endorsement. They'll launch a strike just in time for the summer crime wave, and they will fund your opponent." Richard stared at the paused frame of Lucas Pendleton on the laptop screen. He was trapped in an impossible vice. If he backed the police union and protected Hayes, Judge Pendleton would undoubtedly go public. The footage would leak. It always leaked. The black community, the progressive base, and the moderate suburbanites would abandon him entirely. He would be painted as the racist mayor who covered up the assault of a prominent black leader. But if he fired Hayes to appease Pendleton and the public, Frank Donnelly would mobilize the unions against him. The police would launch a work slowdown, crime would spike, and his conservative base would accuse him of throwing a young cop under the bus for political correctness. He would lose the election before autumn even began. "Where is the footage right now?" Richard asked, his mind racing, looking for a way out of the trap. "Encrypted on this drive and on the precinct's secure server," Jenkins said. "But Pendleton requested a copy. Legally, we have to provide it, and if we don't, he can just subpoena it." "Call Pendleton's chambers," Richard said, a desperate plan forming in his mind. "Tell him I want to meet. Privately. Off the books. Tonight." "Richard," Jenkins warned, "Lucas Pendleton is not a man you can bribe. You try to offer him a settlement to keep quiet, he'll hang you from the rafters." "I'm not going to bribe him," Richard said, his eyes hardening as he looked out over the city he was desperately trying to keep control of. "I'm going to ask him to help me fix this, or at least buy me enough time to figure out how to survive it." He looked back at the screen, at the calm, resolute face of the judge. The Cold War had just begun in Oak Haven, and Mayor Richard Caldwell knew that by the end of the week there would be blood on the marble floors of City Hall. He just had to make sure it wasn't his. The mayoral residence in the Gracewood district was an imposing Tudor-style mansion set far back from the street, shielded by ancient, sprawling oak trees and a wrought-iron gate. Normally, it was a place of lavish fundraisers and clinking champagne glasses. Tonight, the house was entirely dark, save for the dim golden glow emanating from the library on the ground floor. Richard Caldwell stood by the marble fireplace, swirling a heavy crystal glass of 20-year-old bourbon. He hadn't taken a sip. He was too busy listening to the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, waiting for the doorbell to ring. When it finally did, Richard jumped slightly, spilling a drop of amber liquid onto his thumb. He quickly wiped it off, set the glass down, and walked to the front door himself, having dismissed his private security detail and household staff hours ago. He needed absolute secrecy. He pulled the heavy wooden door open. Judge Lucas Pendleton stood on the threshold. He had changed out of his athletic wear and was now dressed in a sharply tailored, charcoal grey suit, an overcoat draped immaculately over his shoulders. He looked every inch the formidable magistrate he was. "Lucas," Richard said, forcing a tight, welcoming smile. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please come in." Lucas stepped into the foyer, his polished shoes silent on the hardwood. He did not return the smile. "Your message said it was a matter of extreme municipal urgency, Richard. I assumed the city was on fire." "It might be," Richard replied, leading the way into the library and closing the heavy double doors behind them. He gestured toward a pair of leather wing-back chairs. "Can I pour you a drink, McCallan?" "I don't drink when I'm negotiating, Mr. Mayor," Lucas said calmly, remaining standing. "And given the circumstances of my afternoon, I can only assume we are here to negotiate." Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping as the political facade cracked. He walked over to his glass and took a long, burning swallow. "Sarah Jenkins showed me the footage, Lucas. I am horrified. I am so deeply sorry for what happened to you today. It is completely unacceptable. It is a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment and a textbook example of racial profiling," Lucas corrected smoothly, his voice devoid of anger but heavy with absolute certainty. "But you didn't invite me here at 10 o'clock at night to apologize. You could have done that over the phone. You invited me here because you know who arrested me." Richard sank into one of the wing-back chairs, rubbing his temples. "Officer Derek Hayes, Frank Donnelly's nephew. The head of the Police Benevolent Association." Lucas nodded slowly, finally taking a seat opposite the mayor. He crossed his legs, adjusting the crease of his trousers. "The man holding your re-election by the throat. I see the chessboard, Richard. You're paralyzed." "I am trying to prevent a disaster, Lucas," Richard pleaded, leaning forward. "If I fire Hayes tomorrow, Donnelly will pull the union's endorsement. He'll orchestrate a blue flu. Cops will call out sick in droves, response times will triple, and crime will spike just as the summer heat wave hits. The city will descend into chaos, and I will lose the election to a hardline conservative who will give the union whatever they want." "And if you don't fire him?" Lucas asked, his dark eyes fixed on the mayor. "If I don't fire him, you'll release the footage. The ACLU will riot, the press will crucify me, and I'll lose my progressive base. I'm dead either way," Richard said bitterly. "So I am asking you, as a man who loves this city as much as I do, to give me time. Let me put Hayes on paid administrative leave. Let the internal affairs process play out quietly over the next 6 months. By the time the investigation concludes, the election will be over. I'll have the political capital to fire him, and Donnelly won't be able to stop me. Just sit on the tape. For the good of the city." Lucas sat in silence for a long moment. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the quiet room. "For the good of the city," Lucas repeated softly, tasting the words. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, closing the distance between them. "Richard, do you know how many young black and brown men have stood before my bench this year alone, charged with resisting arrest by the officers of the 14th Precinct?" Richard blinked, caught off guard by the pivot. I don't have those metrics in front of me." 84, Lucas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. 84 young men. And in almost 60% of those cases, the initial stop was for something trivial. Loitering, a broken tail light, jaywalking. Cases that escalated to violence because of officers like Derek Hayes. Men who didn't have a judicial credential in their back pocket to save them from a holding cell, or worse. Lucas stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the Persian rug. "You think this is about me being embarrassed in front of City Hall?" Lucas asked. "I've been compiling a dossier on the 14th Precinct for 6 months, Richard. I've been tracking the arrest reports, the excessive force complaints that conveniently disappear, the patterns of racial targeting. Hayes is just a symptom. Frank Donnelly and the culture of total impunity he enforces is the disease." Richard's blood ran cold. "What are you saying, Lucas?" "I'm saying I don't want a quiet administrative leave for Derek Hayes," Lucas stated firmly. "I want his badge stripped tomorrow morning, and then I want you to publicly announce an independent, civilian-led audit of the 14th Precinct. No union interference. "Donnelly will burn the city down," Richard argued, standing up to meet Lucas's gaze. "He will destroy my administration." "If you do not do this," Lucas countered, his voice like grinding granite, "I will not just release the tape to the local news. I will hand the tape, along with my entire 6-month dossier on the 14th Precinct, directly to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. I will invite the federal government to come into your city, put your police department under a federal consent decree, and strip you of your authority entirely." Richard stared at the judge, completely stunned. Lucas wasn't just refusing to play politics. He was threatening to blow up the entire board. "You have until noon tomorrow, Mr. Mayor," Lucas said, turning toward the door. "Make your choice." He walked out of the library, leaving Richard Caldwell alone in the dark, surrounded by the ruins of his political career. The air inside O'Malley's prime rib was thick with the scent of seared meat, stale cigar smoke, and spilled beer. It was a classic, old-world steakhouse nestled deep in the city's working-class South Side, a place where the lighting was always dim and the booths were designed with high leather backs for maximum privacy. Frank Donnelly sat in his usual corner booth, methodically carving into a massive, blood-rare ribeye. Donnelly was a brick wall of a man, with a thick neck, a face map-lined with decades of street patrols, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Across the table sat his nephew, Derek Hayes. Derek wasn't eating. He was staring at his untouched baked potato, his knee bouncing nervously under the table. He had been ordered here immediately after his suspension, and his uncle had barely spoken 2 words to him since he arrived. Frank took a slow, deliberate bite of his steak, chewed it, and swallowed. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. "So," Frank said, his voice a low, rumbling gravel, "you locked up a John Doe outside City Hall, and Miller suspended you on the spot." "Uncle Frank, the guy was refusing to comply," Derek stammered, eager to defend himself. "He was loitering in a secure zone. I asked for ID. He got mouthy. He started quoting laws at me. I thought he was casing the building. I was following standard protocol for a non-compliant suspect." Frank stared at him. "Standard protocol is putting a guy in the dirt over a cup of coffee? Derek, I've spent the last 10 years fighting tooth and nail to keep the mayor's office out of our business. I protect this union. I protect our guys. But you make it damn hard when you act like a cowboy on the mayor's front porch." "I was doing my job," Derek insisted, his face flushing. "Sarge had no right to pull my badge without a union rep present. It's in the contract." Frank's phone buzzed on the table. It was a secure text message. Frank picked it up, expecting it to be his contact in internal affairs with the paperwork on Derek's suspension. Instead, it was a message from a loyal desk sergeant at the 14th Precinct, someone who had been in the booking room when the John Doe was brought in. Frank read the text. Then he read it again. The color drained from Frank Donnelly's ruddy face. He slowly lowered the phone to the table, his eyes locking onto his nephew with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "Derek," Frank said. His voice was suddenly very quiet. "Who did you arrest today?" "I told you, he wouldn't give me a name," Derek said, confused by his uncle's sudden shift in demeanor. "Older black guy, tall, grey hoodie." "Did you run his prints? Did Miller say his name?" "No, Sarge freaked out before we even got to that. He just started yelling at me to take the cuffs off, acting like the guy was the president or something." Frank closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. He took a long, deep breath. When he opened his eyes, they were cold and calculating. "You didn't arrest a John Doe, Derek," Frank said grimly. "You arrested Lucas Pendleton." Derek blinked. The name sounded familiar, but in his panicked state, he couldn't quite place it. "Who?" "Judge Lucas Pendleton," Frank hissed, leaning across the table, his massive hands gripping the edge of the wood. "The chief supervising judge of the Superior Court, the man who signs half the warrants in this city, the man whose endorsement Caldwell needs to keep the minority vote." Derek's mouth fell open. The blood rushed out of his head, leaving him dizzy. "Oh my God. Uncle Frank, I swear to God I didn't know. He was in sweatpants. He didn't look like a judge." "It doesn't matter what he looked like," Frank snapped, his fist slamming down on the table, rattling the silverware. "You put handcuffs on the most powerful black man in the county for standing on a sidewalk. Caldwell is probably watching the body cam footage right now, trying to figure out how to publicly execute you." "What do I do?" Derek panicked, his voice cracking. "They're gonna fire me. They're gonna charge me." Frank leaned back, his mind racing. He was a master tactician, a man who had survived 3 mayors and a dozen police chiefs. He knew that when you were cornered by a superior force, you didn't surrender. You attacked first, and you controlled the narrative. If Caldwell fired his nephew, it would be a sign of weakness. It would show the city that the mayor answered to the judges, not the police. Frank couldn't allow that precedent. "You do nothing," Frank ordered. "You go home, you lock your doors, and you do not speak to anyone. Not your friends, not the department, and absolutely not the press. If anyone asks, you say you feared for your safety, and you were following department protocol regarding unsecured perimeter threats. The union lawyers will handle the rest." Frank pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He stopped on a name, Tom Higgins. Higgins was a senior political reporter for the Monroe Telegraph, a man who owed Frank several massive favors for exclusive scoops over the years. Higgins wasn't known for his journalistic integrity. He was known for loving a sensational headline and hating the liberal establishment. "What are you doing?" Derek asked, terrified. "I'm saving your job," Frank said, hitting the call button. The phone rang twice before a raspy voice answered. "Frankie, it's late. What's bleeding?" "I got a front-page exclusive for you, Tommy," Frank said smoothly, slipping into his press voice. "And you need to run it digitally tonight before the mayor's office tries to bury it." "I'm listening." "We had an incident today," Frank lied effortlessly. "One of my rookies, good kid, was patrolling the city hall perimeter. High alert, given the recent protests. He spots a suspicious individual probing the security line. The guy is aggressive, non-compliant, physically intimidating the officer. The rookie does everything by the book, detains him for everyone's safety." "Okay," Higgins said, sounding bored. "Cop arrests angry guy. Where's the headline?" "The headline, Tommy," Frank said, a wicked grin spreading across his face, "is that the angry guy turned out to be Judge Lucas Pendleton. And instead of letting the system work, Pendleton used his political weight to instantly bully the precinct sergeant into dropping the charges and suspending the rookie without due process. It's a massive abuse of judicial power to crush a working-class cop who was just doing his job." The line went dead silent for a moment. Then Higgins let out a low whistle. "Are you serious? Pendleton got a cop suspended for stopping him?" "Within 10 minutes, Frank confirmed. "The mayor's office is terrified of Pendleton. They're trying to sweep it under the rug to protect the judge's reputation. But my officers deserve better. They shouldn't be punished for enforcing the law just because the suspect wears a robe on Thursdays. I'll have it online in an hour, Frank. Send me the rookie's name." Frank hung up the phone. He looked at Derek, who was staring at his uncle in sheer disbelief. "By midnight, the narrative will be set," Frank said, picking up his fork and returning to his steak. "You aren't a racist cop who assaulted a black man, Derek. You're a hero rookie who is being persecuted by a corrupt, elite judge and a weak mayor." At 11:45 p.m., Richard Caldwell was sitting at his kitchen island, staring blankly at a cold cup of tea, trying to figure out how to meet Lucas Pendleton's impossible demands. His phone buzzed violently against the marble countertop. It was a news alert from the Monroe Telegraph. Richard picked it up. The headline glared back at him in bold black letters: "Abuse of power. Top judge uses influence to crush rookie cop after security stop." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. He dropped the phone onto the counter. Across town, in his quiet study, Lucas Pendleton received the same alert. He read the article, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. Frank Donnelly hadn't just moved a pawn. He had flipped the entire board over. And as Lucas looked out his window into the dark city, he knew that diplomacy was officially dead. It was time to go to war. The morning sun had barely crested the city skyline, but the phones in Mayor Richard Caldwell's office were already screaming. The Monroe Telegraph article had done exactly what Frank Donnelly intended. It had ignited a firestorm. Conservative talk radio was already hailing Derek Hayes as a martyr of the working class, a brave rookie crushed by a woke, elitist judge. Richard's progressive allies were frantically calling, demanding to know if the allegations against Judge Pendleton were true. Richard sat behind his mahogany desk, a cold cup of coffee in his hand, staring at the television mounted on the wall. The local news anchors were breathlessly debating the City Hall standoff. "He checkmated us," Richard muttered, his voice hollow. "Donnelly pinned the judge in the court of public opinion. If I fire the cop now, I look like I'm bowing to a corrupt judge. If I don't, Lucas drops the tape and the ACLU destroys me." The heavy oak doors to his office swung open. Chief Sarah Jenkins didn't walk in. She marched in, her face a mask of absolute unyielding grimness. "Turn it off," Jenkins ordered, pointing at the local news broadcast. "Turn it to CNN." Richard frowned, reaching for the remote. "Sarah, what's going on? Has Donnelly called you?" "Donnelly is a dinosaur playing checkers, Richard," Jenkins said, stepping up to the desk. "Lucas Pendleton is playing three-dimensional chess. Change the channel." Richard clicked the remote. The screen shifted from the local anchors to a live, national feed originating from the steps of the United States District Courthouse in downtown Monroe, 3 blocks away from City Hall. Richard's breath hitched in his throat. Standing behind a cluster of microphones was Judge Lucas Pendleton. He was flanked not by local politicians or activists, but by a phalanx of the most terrifying legal firepower in the country. To his left stood David K. Garrison, the legendary civil rights attorney from Washington, D.C. To his right were senior litigators from the Brennan Center for Justice. "What is he doing?" Richard whispered, horrified. "He's going nuclear." On the screen, Lucas stepped up to the podium. He did not look angry. He looked entirely in his element. The baritone of his voice easily commanded the National Press Corps. "This morning," Lucas's voice echoed through the mayor's office. "At 8:15 a.m., my legal counsel filed a comprehensive federal civil rights lawsuit against the City of Monroe, the Monroe Police Department, and the Police Benevolent Association, specifically citing violations of the RICO Act." Richard dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the floor, brown liquid seeping into the expensive carpet. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Lucas wasn't just suing them. He was legally classifying the police union as a criminal enterprise. "For 6 months," Lucas continued on the screen, his gaze piercing through the camera lens, "I have compiled a dossier detailing a systematic, coordinated effort by the 14th Precinct to violate the constitutional rights of the citizens they are sworn to protect. This culture of brutality and racial profiling is shielded by a union leadership that actively conspires to bury internal affairs complaints intimidate witnesses, and smear victims. Last night, that union leadership attempted to smear me." Lucas paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle over the silent crowd of reporters. "They released a fabricated narrative to a local tabloid, claiming I used my judicial authority to bully a police officer after a routine security stop. They relied on a very old, very tired playbook. Demonize the black man, protect the badge at all costs." Lucas stepped back slightly, allowing David Garrison to take the microphone. Garrison held up a standard-issue police body camera flash drive. "In conjunction with our federal filing," Garrison boomed, "we successfully petitioned Federal Judge Thomas Linwood for an emergency unsealing order. We are releasing the unedited, raw body camera footage of Judge Pendleton's arrest to every media outlet in the country. We will not allow a corrupt union boss to lie to the American public for one more second. Watch the tape, and then ask Mayor Caldwell why he allows thugs with badges to run his city." The CNN broadcast cut away from the courthouse. "They have the tape," Richard gasped, grabbing the edge of his desk. "They're airing it. Oh my God, Sarah, they're airing it right now." The screen flickered. The slick studio graphics vanished, replaced by the shaky, high-definition reality of Officer Derek Hayes's body camera. Richard and Sarah watched in dead silence. Millions of people across the country were watching with them. The audio was crystal clear. "You lost, buddy." They watched Lucas, calm, relaxed, holding his coffee. They heard him recite the law flawlessly. They watched the sudden, unprovoked violence as Hayes lunged forward, grabbed the judge, slammed him against the granite wall, and yanked his arms back. They heard Hayes sneering about showing the street lawyer how bad his afternoon could get. The video ended. The CNN anchors appeared back on screen, visibly shocked. One of them actually had a hand covering her mouth. "Well," Chief Jenkins said quietly, into the deafening silence of the mayor's office, "I believe the phrase is checkmate." Richard Caldwell stared at the television. Frank Donnelly's carefully crafted narrative hadn't just been disproven, it had been eviscerated on a national stage. The video proved unequivocally that Lucas had been polite, compliant, and legally correct, while the officer had been hostile, aggressive, and utterly lawless. His phone began to ring again. Not the progressive allies this time. It was the governor. "Sarah," Richard said, his voice trembling as he realized he had only one play left to survive the day. "Draft the termination papers for Officer Derek Hayes, effective immediately, and get me the Department of Justice on the line. We are surrendering the 14th Precinct to federal oversight." "What about Donnelly?" Sarah asked. Richard's eyes narrowed, a cold, desperate survival instinct kicking in. "Donnelly just committed career suicide on national television. Cut him loose. If he tries to call a strike, I'll have the National Guard in this city by midnight." The atmosphere inside the Police Benevolent Association headquarters was indistinguishable from a funeral. Frank Donnelly sat in his plush office, the blinds drawn shut against the midday sun. The television in this corner was muted, but the chyron scrolling at the bottom of the screen told the whole story. Monroe Mayor, fires officer, in judge assault video, asks DOJ to investigate police union. Frank's phone had been ringing incessantly for 3 hours, but he hadn't answered a single call. The local officers, the men who usually worshipped the ground he walked on, were furious. They had watched the video. Any cop with half a brain knew a bad stop when they saw one. Hayes hadn't just broken protocol. He had made them all look like violent racist amateurs on national television. By lying to them, Frank had destroyed the union's credibility in a single stroke. The door to Frank's office clicked open. Frank didn't look up. "I told the receptionist no visitors." "She tried to stop us," a deep voice replied. She was unsuccessful. Frank's head snapped up. Standing in the doorway was Chief Sarah Jenkins. Beside her were two stern-faced men in dark suits, wearing FBI badges on their lapels. Frank Donnelly, the lead FBI agent said, stepping into the room. We have a federal warrant to secure all digital and physical records in this building pertaining to the Monroe Telegraph leak, as well as all internal union communications regarding Officer Derek Hayes. Frank stood up, his face flushing with rage. You have got to be kidding me. You think you can just waltz in here? Save it, Frank, Jenkins interrupted, her voice like cracking ice. It's over. Mayor Caldwell just held a press conference. He threw you completely under the bus. He stated on the record that you attempted to extort his office to protect your nephew. The DOJ is opening a full RICO investigation into your leadership. Frank's jaw dropped. The foundation of his empire, built over 30 years of intimidation and backdoor deals, was evaporating into thin air. Where is Derek? Frank asked, his voice suddenly sounding very small. Officer Hayes was taken into custody 20 minutes ago by federal marshals, the FBI agent stated flatly. He is being charged with deprivation of rights under color of law. It's a federal felony, Mr. Donnelly. He's looking at up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Frank sank back into his leather chair, the fight draining entirely out of his massive frame. He had tried to protect his blood by playing a dirty game. He hadn't realized he was playing against a master. 2 weeks later, the Monroe County Superior Court, Courtroom 301, was a cathedral of dark oak and polished brass. The gallery was packed, but the room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and the bailiff's voice rang out. All rise. The Superior Court of Monroe County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Lucas Pendleton presiding. Everyone in the room stood up. Lucas walked out slowly, his heavy black robes flowing behind him. He took his seat at the elevated bench, looking out over the courtroom. He arranged his files, placed his reading glasses on the bridge of his nose, and picked up his wooden gavel. The last 2 weeks had torn the city apart and put it back together again. The police chief had resigned. Mayor Caldwell was clinging to his office by a thread, forced to accept total federal oversight of his police department. Frank Donnelly had been ousted by his own union, currently under federal indictment for racketeering, and Derek Hayes was sitting in a federal holding cell, awaiting trial, having learned a devastating lesson about the law. Lucas looked at the docket in front of him. His wrists no longer bore the deep purple bruises of the steel cuffs, but the memory of the cold metal remained. He had used the system he served to strike a blow against the rot within it, tearing down arrogant men who believed a badge was a license for tyranny. He looked down at the young public defender, standing at the primary table, nervously shuffling her papers. Beside her stood a young, terrified black teenager in an oversized orange jumpsuit, arrested the night before for matching a vague description. Lucas looked the young man directly in the eye. He offered a small, reassuring nod, a silent promise that in this room, on this day, the scales of justice would actually be balanced. Lucas raised the wooden gavel and brought it down with a resounding crack that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Be seated," Judge Pendleton commanded. "Let us begin. The line between authority and tyranny is razor thin. And as Officer Hayes and Frank Donnelly learned the hard way, arrogance is a poor substitute for the law. Judge Pendleton didn't just seek personal revenge. He weaponized the truth to dismantle a corrupt system from the inside out, proving that true power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to strike when the time is perfectly right. What would you have done if you were in the mayor's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story of karmic justice, hit that like button, share this with a friend who loves a good legal twist, and subscribe for more incredible real-life dramas every single week.